So the first part we wanted to discuss tonight is just some of those parameters that the group started with. When we brought together the group of teachers and leaders, we asked Dr. Fagans for some parameters around the work that we needed to do. And as Dr. Cook mentioned, number one was to maintain the rigor of the tool. We knew we had a good tool to start with. We wanted to make sure that we maintain that rigor. We also wanted to make sure that of the 29 elements, each one only measured one competency. So that way we were able to give really specific feedback. We were able to really fine-tune the work that each teacher was doing. We had to make sure that it was aligned to the state system. We had to make sure that it's aligned to the strategic plan. We didn't want to ask teachers to do one thing in CITE and another thing with the strategic plan. We wanted that work to be in concert. And we wanted to make sure that we had a learning progression present, which Steve will talk a little more about in depth later. But we wanted to make sure that it was very clear to a teacher, no matter where you were, what step you needed to take to move from effective to highly effective or partially effective to effective. And then finally, we needed to make sure that we had a tool that would get CDE approval. We knew we did that with the first revision, so we wanted to make sure we had that for the second one. So the process, how it started, we pulled together about a month ago 40 teachers and leaders from elementary, middle, and high school. We broke them up into 3 groups. We only focused on CITE standards 1, 2, and 3, so the outcomes, the measurement, and the instruction. We knew standards 4 and 5, culture and climate and professionalism, we're in a pretty good state. We didn't have a lot of feedback that those needed to be updated. So we split that group into 3, really dug into that work, and then kind of shifted everyone around so all 40 participants had a chance to look at all the work of all 3 levels. From there, we brought it back to the PK-12 department, and Dr. Cook, myself, and our directors went through it, looked for consistency of verbiage. From there, we took it to academic cabinet, where, for instance, if we're looking at world-class outcomes in Standard 1, we had the world-class education department look through it and make sure that we were speaking with one voice. Same thing for Standard 2 with assessment. Finally brought it to cabinet last Thursday and had a larger discussion, presenting it tonight to the board with going to the DAC, I believe probably 3 weeks from tonight, to run that by DAC and get any of their feedback, and then bring it back to you hopefully a month from tonight for approval so that we have it ready to go pretty close to the first day of school for staff. We've made that commitment that once the school year starts, any work that has to be done we'll do in the background, but we won't change the actual tool once the school year starts.
So some of the things that popped out immediately through the process, the first one that we felt like was an obvious standard was that rigor was maintained throughout the new system. And if anything, it might be raised just a hair on the low end of it, just because of some of the language, some more consistency to the language of the ineffective levels and maybe even a little bit of the partially effective level. Really well communicated on that as well, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. The other thing that came out of this real quickly was we want to put in front of every student, we would love to be able to put a highly effective teacher in front of every student. And so if they are not currently being evaluated at that level for that particular element, what's our plan for how to get them to that level? And it follows perfectly with what they just talked about in CPD, is that it shouldn't be ambiguous. There should be very clear mechanisms for ways to get to that goal statement at that goal end. And so one of the things that we've already started doing is starting to collect data on what do you see in this new language as we start working this through in Leadership Academy. What are the things that already you're looking at as a leader or as a teacher and going, I'm not sure I understand what this means, so that we can start building in those systems of support and making sure that we're catching them with all things, because we would like everybody to have this opportunity to qualify through this system as best as possible. The third thing, it was this, and there was a lot of discussion about this third one. This one's really important to talk about, and it is the value of frequency, because what that immediately does is it creates a system between evaluator and evaluatee that implies multiple interactions. And that is such a difficult thing to put a number on when you start talking about classroom. If you just were to quantify this to a percentage, for example, 70%, well, then that immediately implies I got to get in there 7 times to be able to say, or 10 times to be able to say 7 out of 10 times they met this standard. And if I don't, then can I fairly measure that? And so the consistency of the language we used in changing that to kind of get to a frequency measure may be the single most important thing we've done, because now that dialogue can start and it puts the burden on both to talk about how are we going to interact together in this measure for each element, not just one or two of the elements, but for all of them. And we've gotten tremendous feedback. We've presented this four separate times at Leadership Academy about taking those numbers as a criteria out and pushing that frequency measure into the dialogue between the evaluator and the evaluatee. And that's been really powerful feedback for us. Another really high quality piece I think you'll notice when you look at this is that in Standard 1, we've broken out the curriculum piece. Actually, I'm going to talk about the next two of these two things together. The significant focus on the components of the GVC and that horizontal alignment, this really shaped things much more clearly for this. Instead of talking about the GVC or world-class outcomes in kind of this batch, we've now aligned them so that 1.1 is world-class outcomes. 2.1, it talks about assessing world-class outcomes. 3.1 talks about the delivery and instruction of world-class outcomes, and that pattern flows all the way through the first four elements in each one of the standards. And that's going to make it a lot easier, both for understanding and delivery, and also for looking for continuity's sake and purpose for both the evaluator and the evaluatee. And then the last piece was the one that we probably spent the most time on. We didn't want to get into wordsmithing or just getting into the semantics of it, but consistency of language really has made a difference in this document. I think you'll see that when you get a little bit of a time to look through that. And I think, and I'm hopeful, that anything that we've done with rigor at the top end of this, I believe will be really, people have said, okay, maybe the rigor is a little higher, does seem a little higher on the bottom end of this, but the clarity of language will make it easier to attain, if that makes a little bit of sense. All right, so next steps, and we've kind of talked about this a little bit. We need DAC's eyes on this. We need your guys' approval before we can go forward on this, and then we're going to spend this next month making sure those two things, any questions or concerns that would come up with that, we want to make sure we can get the chance to address that. And then we want to also send this back to the team of teachers and administrators that developed this. They spent a lot of blood, sweat, and tears poring over this and arguing and fussing and fighting and advocating for all of those components and pieces that they felt so passionate and powerful about. Then we're collecting data already on what are those things that we get from Leadership Academy, the learning progressions you see already. What questions do you have about what this means? Some of the aligning with the CDE tool, and we showed them the CDE tool, and I can tell you this, that every teacher that was in that room, well, I can't speak for every teacher, but at least the ones that were verbally willing to say it were like, oh my gosh, I'm so glad we're not using that tool. This tool makes so much more sense to us. And so we're getting their feedback as well. And how are we going to make sure that the crosswalk pieces that we have to have, because CDE says you have to have these pieces, make good sense to our educators as well? We want to be in a supportive role in that regard, not say that the state is wrong or not say that their tool is bad or our tool is better, but we want to make sure our teachers understand what we expect through the tool. And then last but not least by any means is talking about the process of evaluation. I think one of the things that we've been really good about historically, at least last year, I can speak directly to this, was that we understood exactly as evaluators and principals what was needed to make sure we met the mandates, the non-negotiables, the timelines, those kinds of things. And now we're going to start putting back into into the system some conversations about what are best practices for this. How are you going to get the largest bang for your buck at the building level, and how are you going to support teachers? What's the end game on this really? Is it about a raise? Is it about a rating? Or is it about developing teacher skills from within the system? And our goal is to make sure that that's understood, and what's the best mechanism for that? And if people have great ideas, having mechanisms, just like CPD said, where we can collect that information, get it into the system, and pervade out to everyone. And so that piece is really important. The fourth bullet on there is probably one of the most important, and I think it's one of the things that we've talked about a lot already, even just in the Leadership Academy. Autonomy is one of the things we live by in Douglas County. We want schools to be able to deliver to their constituents what they need and what they value. But the system can't be autonomous. It has to be the same for all. And so it shouldn't matter wherever a teacher is. If you drop a teacher from one building to another, they should expect the same system. And so one of the things we want to ensure is that the consistency exists no matter where they are. And that's going to be a challenge, and one of those things that we're really going to focus on this year, to really get that system to be able to grow itself and to improve itself at all times. Okay? Questions?
Director Richardson, you can lead off.
And on that last point, I think you have the total support of this board in the criticality of that kind of consistency throughout the system. So we encourage you as you take these next steps to develop the mechanisms to ensure that's the case. We now have 2 data points, and in a year hence we'll have 3, and maybe it's at the end of this year that we would have enough data to do this. But I'm interested in the mobility between ratings of individuals. If you're sort of familiar with national income sociology, there's this thing called the Gini coefficient that measures changes in income grouping. Relatively lower income folks become middle class become wealthy, wealthy drop out. And it's one of the great sociological success stories, by the way, of the United States, that we have great mobility between classes relative to other industrial economies. I'm interested in the mobility, if we can start to track that, of, for example, partially effective instructors getting that clear vision of a need to improve and changing and stepping up their game and becoming effective teachers or even highly effective teachers. Similarly, we know that there is some percentage of humanity that's going to see success as breeding complacency and complacency failure. So to the extent that anyone in the highly effective category drops, I would be interested in that. As sort of an additional sort of slice of data that just kind of tells me something about the validity of what we're doing. So I don't know if it's the right time after 2 data sets, maybe it's 3, but I would encourage you to begin to think how we measure the changes in individuals, anonymously, of course, in where they shake out in the system, in the rating levels. Is that possible to do?
I got this. Yeah. So I think I understand what you're asking for, and I think there's definitely some truth to what you're asking about. A couple of things I would throw in there for that. You're going to have longitudinal data points, obviously, because you're going to have the same individuals over time. You're going to have a way of collecting that and a way of measuring that. And in a perfect world, in a controlled environment, you would want to change absolutely no other variables but the learning and progressions that they're getting as they grow as educators. And so I think to some extent we can do that, but it's going to be contaminated data in some regards. But I still think we could get general trends with that. In a perfect world, we would have said, okay, then we can't change the tool, because the second we change the tool, we start with a new data set. That being said, I think one of the things we can do with this is you can get a lot of qualitative discussion. We've already started talking about that with your evaluators. A building principal has a pretty good feel for every one of those. I shouldn't say just any evaluator in a building level, so not just your principals, but your assistant principals. Remember, principals only evaluate about 40% of the staff that they have as a collective, because you have assistant principals that are also responsible for doing this. But through the system, we should be able to collect a lot of that data, at least qualitatively, maybe not to the point of quantitative data like I think what you would like to see as far as that progression goes. The mobility piece, for goodness sakes, I hope it's all unidirectional. I don't ever want to see somebody dropping, and so I hope we would see that over time. But that intent would be, what are those checks and balances that we're seeing? Because quite frankly, that's the information that we need to work with CPD on about, as we provide that learning progression, what are we going to do to make sure that that pathway exists and that we can document that if you do these things, not just that we're providing them, and I think it goes back to the question you had for CPD, it's the same thing. We don't want to just provide classes, whether there's 40,000 of them or 80,000 of them. We want to intentionally provide classes that move people through the system that benefits our children.
That triggered a thought for me in terms of taking it and marrying it with, we've also looked at just mobility and turnover and things in the district. And I think we can get 2 or 3 years of data, but I think at any point you've got mature data, you can look from one year to the next. And on one axis, I would like to see our existing teachers, highly effective, effective, partially effective, ineffective, and then in addition, a row for not yet in our district, and it would be taught elsewhere and then brand new to the profession. And then across the top axis, you could have where did they go in the next year, so that you're also looking at the entrance into our system, and then you can also look at our breakdowns of where we've got our effectiveness and anyone who exits our system. So first of all, they could stay highly effective, they could, or move up to it, they could be effective, they could be partially effective, ineffective. They could also then have retired, they could have left for another district, or they could have stayed within the district and taken a promotion. I think that matrix would be some fascinating distribution and movement of not just did you come in and out of our district, but once you're in it, where have you been moving and progressing with your development?
Well, and I would argue, I love that idea, Kevin, and I think it's important to as a measure of the system as compared to other systems. And I would take it, posit that, move that forward 3 or 4 years, I would posit that we could even find out how those people that leave our system are being evaluated at a state level system or other systems, because that's going to be public data in a few years once they get that system kind of tweaked into place. And I would argue that you would see a much higher performance out of people that left our system because of the training they can get here. And I would put, I think Pat understated his department, and deservedly so. I would put anything that we do at CPD up against anybody's in any district, and you would see anybody that were to leave our district. I would believe this, and we can't get the data now, but I would argue that in 3 or 4 years, when that data exists, we should be evaluating that.
Well, and I'm hopeful then that our systems that we've talked about that we're implementing that would contain this is something that we could make a regular ongoing report, because then we can certainly see where this movement and growth is, because that's really what we want to be able to share with our parents and community, is to say our composite level of teaching in this district has gone up, whether it's been through the growth within and it's attracted and acquired others that are at high effective levels. This is bringing, in some kind of a measure, this is the composite, teaching effectiveness of Douglas County School District.
Right.
I think that would be
I couldn't agree more.
a great dashboard, and more than a dashboard, but it'd be a great indicator, but something that we could dive into and really look at the movement. Director Silverthorne.
Thank you guys very much. I know this was probably very challenging, and you guys put in a lot of work. And as someone who assisted in creating one evaluation, I can't imagine what it must have been like to do what you've done. I'm extremely interested in the consistency bullet point. I obviously that has been something that has inspired a lot of conversations throughout the district. So how, if you had to, and perhaps you have or have not developed a final plan for how to ensure that, but what are your preliminary ideas on how to make sure that you have consistent training of all the teachers, make sure that all the principals know what they're doing? Do you have point people at the schools? What do you envision for making sure that we have consistency and making sure that everybody's questions are answered accurately across the board?
I think it's multifaceted. I mean, we've had, as you saw, we have training at the Leadership Academy. We have training coming up at PK-12 meetings, training at level meetings, instructional rounds where groups of people are going out to various schools, kind of co-going into classrooms and making sure there's that alignment. And I think I think this will be much easier as we've clarified some of that language, that when you hop into one school and hop into another, that you see that. And I think that will come over time, and a lot of it's going to be through dialogue. It's going to have to be purposeful training that we do, whether it's showing a video clip of a teacher to 48 principals and everyone's sitting there saying, go through standard 3 on the rubric, and let's talk about why you think this is partially effective, you think this is effective. So I think it's going to be ongoing and it's going to be continual, but we've got to hit it from a lot of different angles. But we have a lot of that training already set out, both holistically and by element. So looking specifically at outcomes with the world-class ed department, looking specifically at instruction with CPD, so that we have the experts in the room with the principals having that conversation. And then there's an expectation when Steve talked about what are our parameters, but then more importantly, what are best practices, that the training that we do is modeling for what we expect principals to then go back and do with their staffs. So it permeates through the entire system.
And what is the timeline that you see this occurring on? So obviously school is going to start before we know it. Mm-hmm. So, if we're having the tool stay the same throughout the year, that's obviously very helpful. But, if we're looking at rolling out training over a long period of time, then, conceivably it could be Christmas before everybody knows what they're doing, and that's probably not the best timeline. I mean, but I'd like to know what you think.
We spent, I think, about 3 hours today going over what that looks like. There's a lot of competing interests that all need to be done in August. So we talked about doing some high-level training early on so that everyone understands the instrument and can get started with some of those early processes like goal setting and some of those things, but then digging in deeper in September, in October, in November, but making sure that everyone has a good, solid understanding of that tool before we start, and then understanding that as you ramp up formal observations, as you ramp up classroom walkthroughs, that we would continue to dig deeper, and that we would most likely make that ongoing. That wouldn't be something that we would do one time.
And something that we could add to that is about the process of evaluation completely. This isn't a linear growth and an end game that we're all there qualified. It asymptotes, and you get to this point of a lost return on how much investment you're putting into this. We are nowhere near there yet, and that's fine because we've got our work cut out for us and we're ready to take that challenge on. But one of the things I think is important to mention here is giving the structure around that. I think it's one of the pieces that we could really support the system very well with, is starting to put the box around the expectation of how. Because a tool is a tool, and we've used this. I apologize if this analogy seems simple, but a hammer can do great work or a hammer can do crummy work. And the evaluation document is just a tool. We have not done anything to improve teacher performance by making a tool that we don't implement correctly. So the next piece is, how do we implement these processes, and then how do we maintain that system? And it needs to grow not just for this year or even August or even through December. This has to be ongoing and continuous every single month of the year, and including next year and the following year. And every time you integrate new systems, new variables into it, what impact does that have? New people that come in, people that leave. How does that impact the system? And so that has to be comprehensive. We have to make sure that we're attending to that across all aspects. That's a great question, and it's maybe the single most important question, but that question has probably a dissertation or a thesis for an answer. But it's real. It is real. And I can tell you we've talked about that ad nauseum.
Well, and that's good because we want it to be very thoughtful. And of course, we could sit here and talk all night about that one subject. But I did want to make sure that I understood what the direction was and to help, especially our stakeholders in the community, understand how are we addressing the consistency through CITE, and what does that mean for our teachers, and what does that mean for our students. So thank you very much.
Absolutely. I want to add one caveat to this. This is one rubric of 26. I want to make sure we make that clear. We have 26 different rubrics. This is the kind of the foundational piece. We call it the generalist rubric. And so this generalist rubric is kind of the seminal one that we work all the others off of. And that process is starting right now, kind of with your blessing on this, that we have permission to move forward with in draft form, the intent of trying to make the other 25 of these kind of coalesce into the same kind of language. I can tell you this, that we've committed to that we will not change something mid-stride. So if we do not feel like we can have it done and ready to go by the beginning of school, we're telling the groups that we're just going to table them till next year. And we will not change their rubric mid-year. Their rubric will stay the same. And we're going to just go by, I guess you'd say our priority would be by groups impacted, by size of groups impacted, and try to do that in the best, it's officially I'm not even hired yet, so we're trying to do this work quick. So the goal is to try to have this ready to go by the first day of school for all schools, and however that works out would be the best case scenario. If we can get to 25 of 26, that'd be awesome. If we get to 26, we won't. I'm going to tell you that right now, we won't. There's some of these are very divergent from the original, and we've really got to be intentional about that. And we're not going to do it. We want the teachers to have their voice in this, and so that takes time, and we're not going to do this to them. We're going to do this with them.
So if I understand what you're saying, then you have this tool that you are ready to go with effectively right now. You're kind of having conversations, the final conversations around this tool. And then you're going to use that tool to inform the rest of your tools, which you are kind of saying realistically you probably won't have done by the beginning of the school year. So for the folks whose tool you don't have done, what are we going to do with them? What instrument are going to be, or tools are going to be used for those folks who, if we're trying not to plop something in their laps mid-year, then what is going to be done throughout the year for them?
there's the rest of the tools kind of fall in two areas. We have ones that our department will look at: art, music, PE, which we should be able, getting those groups together, obviously, those shouldn't be big fixes. 17 of those 26 fall in Dr. Germain's department with personalized learning, whether it's school psychologists, social workers. He has sat down with his team and kind of prioritized, and I think they're comfortable saying that they know I believe it's 6 most impacted, meaning multiple people using it, will be able to get done before school starts. And for example, if the child find, which may have, I don't know, half a dozen people using that template, that he will sit down with them and explain, do we want to work on this? Do we want to hurry up and get it done? If not, they'll use the rubric they used this year, continuing on. So it won't be anything new for them, but it's going to be with the understanding with that group that, do we want to pause for a year and make sure we have time to do this well, so that everyone's on the same page. With the ones that affect many people, we're confident, and Dr. Germain's confident that we can get those done.
Director Reynolds.
Thank you for your work on this. I appreciate it, and I look forward to see what you guys have to share with the AC next month. The timeline seems to be part of the issue with the revisions on this. So how can we make that more of an ongoing process with those teachers that are involved in a specific rubric? How can we make that much more of an maybe ongoing process, so that we don't have this big crunch here in July and early August to try and get this done before the first day of school?
That's a great question. Thank you. One of the things that popped up early with the original group of 40 that started with this summer was they're quickly crystallized a discussion about there might even be an interest in going from 4-value scale to a 5-value scale. Now, name them however you wish, but highly effective, something else, all the way down to ineffective. And then they realized all of a sudden, if we've got 26 different rubrics and we have 4 ratings per element, there's 29 elements on a rubric, that you start doing the math on it, it's almost 1,000 rewritings. And so the first discussion was really kind of an agreement of, how about we get to this point where we like the language of this, and if we really want to go that direction, let's spend this year talking about that and really getting into what would that look like. What's the difference between sort of effective and pretty darn effective? What does that look like, and how do you qualify that in 29 elements on 26 different rubrics, which is, I think, a great conversation to have, but you can't have it in 2 weeks in the summer. So that work that group is ready to take that on. They're wanting to have that conversation, and they're very interested in that conversation. I don't know if it'll wind up with a 5-rating system, but that might be a next recommendation you would hear from us at this time next year, potentially. There was a lot of great discussion with that, though.
That's the hardest thing to communicate, is actually how to move up, how to do something better, how to give a bunch of evaluations, probably many of you have. We can tell you, how do I take the next step? And that's really hard to communicate. So you better really stop and think,
Right.
and give them really thoughtful advice. And you're real deliberate, by the way. You're going to give them advice on how to move up. And if they follow through on it and they do a good job, you got to be prepared to.
But not just the advice. I think that's critical. I think you're spot on with that. Not just the advice, but the system for training to access that. Truth be told, if we've got somebody that measures out officially as partially effective, but they say, I want to learn in every single way, then my goodness, it's our obligation and our commitment to make sure they have access to everything they need to make that growth.
Director Richardson.
Just to follow up, on Director Silverthorne's question about consistency, it's absolutely critically important to the success of this program that we have that. And I'm sure we have, obviously there's also a role for sort of verification. That's one instrument for facilitating consistency. And also, at least in my experience, we're in a large organization about the same size as this one, 6,000 employees. We looked at what we called the bubble, which was the lowest set of individuals in each category and the highest, and then tried to go across the organization to make sure roughly we had similar delineation at the bubble between categories. That was a very efficient way to check consistency. in my experience. But the other thing it seems to me that we want to emphasize with raters systemically across sites is a couple of things. I mean, not only consistency, but also a sense of, and I think this is embedded in my previous question, a sense that no one has a lock on anything. The relevant reporting period is the objective focus of performance. And so the fact that someone was in a particular category in the last reporting period is just not a criterion for the present period. And so that's really what I was trying to get at, that we would expect to see in an objective process some degree of mobility. For the reasons I just talked about. There's a behavioral response to this feedback. People that get a lower rating step up their game and improve. And there's even some element, that highly successful element, that gets complacent. That's part of any human population. So we would expect to see mobility in a system that doesn't have locks. The other point I guess I would suggest that in training and communicating with raters is we also, at least for this board member, there is a dynamic quality to our standards. I mean, it's embedded really in the concept of rigor that you started your presentation with. We are raising the bar all the time. This is not a static sort of a set of measures. We expect this organization to improve over time, and our concept of highly effective performance is ever greater. And so I would encourage you to share with raters that, staticism, if you will, in terms of these evaluations is the beginning of a failure. And so that we've got to constantly be saying our expectations, as in every other aspect of human endeavor, increase as a function of time.
Yeah, I want to say one thing. One thing I would like to say to that, I think that's very, very critical, and I love that use. And without risking the use of analogies too much, I would like to say, that I wonder, tonight's the All-Star game, the Major League Baseball All-Star game, which I should be at, but it's okay. I would argue that it would be very difficult for some of the All-Stars in 1965 to be able to make the All-Star team now, because the system has improved that much. And just because you were ever elected to your first All-Star game does not mean you're an All-Star for life. And I think that's a very important part of the system. And I think that's something that I have heard through the system to some extent already. I think that message is going to be pretty easy to sync with teachers and with evaluators, that we're in a continuous improvement model, and it's going to continue to spiral up. And I don't think anyone would argue with that concept. I do think that it is really important for us to be aware of that, and it's also really important for us to support that model.
And I think one of the mechanisms we have in place, to Director Reynolds' point, was we will have a lot of work going on in the background throughout the year. And we were very clear with the group that the bar that we have now and the rubric that we have now is what we're asking people to know, but that will change over time. Assessment's a very good example where we talked about this is what we're asking in assessment, but we realize as our folks accomplish this that we will probably need to raise that bar to ultimately get. So there are some built-in mechanisms in the rubric where the group acknowledges the fact that we will need to continue as we learn more to raise that bar even higher, which hopefully should help with that kind of complacency aspect that just because I've achieved this won't be good enough 5 years from now.
I just want to underscore, this is so important. And I think about where we were 5 years ago when we were still paying people according to the number of years of service they had and whether they had a master's degree or not. That was the sophistication of our compensation system. And we're now, and this is hard. It's hard to get right. It's hard to do, but it's so important. It's so important. We have to do it. I've said this repeatedly, and I will continue to talk about it. We have empirical data to support this approach. Harvard just put out a 40-year longitudinal study looking at the difference in lifetime earnings for students who had a highly effective teacher in 4th grade and students who had an ineffective teacher in 4th grade. And the present value difference in the lifetime earnings of those students with a highly effective teacher in the front of the class was $250,000. $250,000 times 25 students, let's say, in a class, is between $6 and $7 million in additional national income that highly effective teachers produce every year. And so not only does this underscore the importance of differentiating along these lines and giving people performance reviews, it also underscores the importance of compensating highly effective teachers to reflect the incredible value they add to our economy and to our culture. So this is critically important. There are a few things that are more important than this, and I commend you for the hard work and effort that you're putting into such an important part of what we're doing in this district.
I just want to ask, and I think some of them have been addressed, but someone who was not able to be here, and I had a chance to meet in the last month one-on-one. This is a person whose job it's part-time and it's also a specialist. It's not a classroom teacher, so the concern was if that position doesn't quite fit into that, are all of our 26 covering the entire gamut of that to include a literacy specialist who's part-time and in between classrooms?
Well, I think there's actually, sounds like there's two questions in there. And the first question, or the first answer is yes, that's the reason we have 26 different rubrics. Right. The second part of that question is that we have actually a percentage of our staff in buildings that might be on two separate kinds of, they do more than one role. And they might teach, for example, they might be an ESL teacher half-time and a literacy teacher half-time. So you're actually using two separate rubrics, and how do you marry that? Right. That, in essence, how do you marry that those evaluations to the work that teacher is going to do, or that instructor? And it could be through, you tend to see more of that with people in the personalized learning because there is such personalized expectation of that. But that isn't necessarily uncommon. That's fairly common, I would say, in most buildings. You're going to have, not a lot, but you might have one or two of those people who have split responsibilities like that. Right.
And with that, and again, if there's the disconnect and it just needs to be communicated, I think then maybe a connection needs to be made. If they feel their site doesn't match their position and responsibilities, how can that get resolved, and how can they then prove their effectiveness if they're in that situation? Do we have remedies or a way to reconcile?
I think proactively is a conversation with their administrator. At the end of their evaluation, if you're asking if they don't agree, we have second look process, we have an appeal process. So
right. I think this person's concern was more on the front end to know, hey, the site. And again, I think we were looking retrospectively at last year instead of forward at this year, where we're now increasing the spectrum. Maybe I'll just cut you one off, and maybe the appropriate person could follow up and reach out to this person, because their last question was who in the district could help make sure that gets revised or reconciled sooner or later. So I just want to make sure to convey that and let you folks follow up. And
I would encourage you, if you hear from people with questions like that, if you could just send them to us, we'd be happy to meet with them and resolve all their concerns. And, because out of 3,600 teachers or 7,000 employees, we're really happy to work with the people that feel that they need additional support, because the directors for the various levels are very familiar with all 26 rubrics and happy to work with the principal to find the right one. And actually, when Child Find folks, and again, there's probably half a dozen of them, came forward and said, what we do is really unique, and we don't feel that any of these really fit. We said, completely agree, and developed an additional rubric. So that's the way that it's been organically growing. And so each one of the different departments have been really paying attention to that. And I think HR has been really good at pointing out that, in the past, there are all these people that were on teacher contracts, and we realize there are so many different things that they add to the value of our students and what they get every day. We want to make sure we're measuring the most important things that each one does, and so we're committed to that.
Right. And again, as it was submitted as almost a public comment, but they couldn't be here to make it, and it was relevant to this discussion, I thought, I'm going to take care of that opportunity to get it to your attention. But yes, we'll let you address it, so thank you for that. Any other? Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very, very much.